for a few years and returned to the town, and I realised that driving up from the south coast to London, I was always tempted to keep heading. My earliest literary memories involved traipsing along to the Kirkcudbright Library, which was based in Broughton House in the late 1960s. My first writing was at the age of 6, quite worryingly, entitled A Golden Verse of Alcohol. And it seems to have consisted of copied and original jingles celebrating that legal drug. I carried on writing, but ran out of enthusiasm for prose and poetry after doing 4 years of it at the university. Most of my writing since the 90s has been in the form of songs. My bookshelves have quite a diverse population, represented in great part by the British New Wave science fiction authors of the 1960s, but also by Dickens and Hardy, Joyce and Canute, Orwell, William Burroughs, and a fair selection of Scottish authors, in particular Neil Gordon and George Mackay-Brown. I'm more and more attracted to writing about what I know, which in turn seems more and more limited to this place. And hopefully carries on in a loop. An accidental paraffin oiler. When I retired in August 2019, my intention was to visit the lighthouses worked at by my grandfather Hugh Thomson during his career with the Northern Lighthouse Board between October 1921 and October 1958. COVID delayed this for a couple of years, but in 2022 I took off in my camper van and visited the Shetlands, Orkneys and Points North East. Last year I ventured up to Lewis and Harris, Mull and the Mull of Kintyre, and the Isle of May and the Forth. I still have Inchkeith on the Forth and the Bellrock to visit, and hopefully I'll get through those this year. I had the good fortune to grow up with Hugh, still alive and generally fit and able. He died when I was 17, but had lived in a cottage off the High Street in Kirkcudbright since before I was born. So I was a frequent visitor, eating slugs in his garden when a toddler, much to his amusement and my mother's horror, and sharing a Piccadilly on tip or two with him as an adolescent, again much to my mother's horror, and no doubt to his amusement. He was to be an old man throughout that time. Indeed, he reached the age of 86, which is still a record in my family as far as I can determine. But his brain was sharp until a year or so before his death, starting to fog as his body gave way to the brittleness of bone. I was, however, very much aware that he had once been a younger man, with an active working life in the NLB. Pieces of NLB issue crockery and cutlery were in use in his cottage, and my sister and I used to enjoy putting on his uniform cap. We were less aware of his life prior to that, though he did occasionally refer to his experiences in the First World War. Hugh came from Lighthouse stock. Indeed, the Thomsons were what is known as paraffin oilers. Both his father and grandfather having served with the NLB as far back as 1856. At that point, James Thomson, originally from Campbellton in the Mull of Kintyre, made the trip to the Isle of Man to take up his first post at the Point of Ayre Lighthouse, the Isle of Man being covered by the Northern Lighthouse Board at the time, and still is. Whilst there, he also picked up my great-great-grandmother, Jane Cumming, and together they moved around the northern west of Scotland, retiring at the Mull of Kintyre and enjoying a long retirement there. James's son, also James, followed him into the service, beginning his career at MacArthur's Head and Sound of Islay, where, like father, like son, he also acquired a wife, Christina McCorkadale, and they then made a slightly more expansive tour of the Scottish coast, ranging from Arnish Point and Stornoway Harbour down to Eyemouth on the east coast, close to the English border. They had 9 children on the travels, only the eldest, Jeannie, not surviving to reasonable old age, she dying of typhoid at the age of just 19 in 1913. Hugh was born into Victoria's late reign and served in the First World War. There are none of that generation left now. He was of the generation of lighthouse keepers who made a career which finished naturally. His successors were not so fortunate. Hugh's younger brother John also became a keeper of the NLB and was principal lighthouse keeper at Little Ross at the time of the infamous murder in 1960. Following this, he and his son James, by then the 4th generation of Thomson in the service, shut down the light to ready it for oscillation. The last of the board's resident keepers were removed from Fair Isle on 31st of March 1998. Lights are now controlled remotely from NLB headquarters in Edinburgh. The buildings in which the keepers and often their families live are either derelict or used as holiday accommodation. Road-based, the lights are maintained for essential maintenance access, but often look quite discouraging to the casual visitor. It's a way of life that began about 250 years ago and disappeared in the last 30 years, but during the existence of the service, it absorbed whole families, sustained communities, and saved countless lives around Scotland. Hugh did not initially plan to follow the family trade. He was apprenticed in a shipyard in Clydebank in 1911, serving the majority of his time as an apprentice fitter before the First World War intervened, and he volunteered to join the Royal Naval Reserve. He shipped to Gallipoli in time for that debacle, where he was wounded by shrapnel in his arm, scars which were visible to the end of his days 65 years later. Evacuated to Malta, he recuperated there, no doubt enjoying the Mediterranean climate a while before being entrained to France, in time to join in the fun and games at the Somme in 1916. Luck, or ill luck, he sustained a bullet wound in his behind during that campaign, which could have been much more serious. I never learned whether that was visible as well. It would have been much more serious had it been a few inches higher. It may have, however, have removed him from the fighting as it developed. Having recovered, he then joined the newly formed Royal Flying Corps as a mechanic. He served in France and latterly Ireland with his service. He was discharged from the RFC in 1921, the full head of hair evident in the limited number of pictures we have from the early years of the war and those before it rapidly dwindling. It must have been a relatively easy decision to revert to the family service in the NLB, with the prospect of pension, accommodation, relative peace and quiet, and work which would use some of his skills with other competences being acquired through on-the-job training. So in October 1921, he arrived at the furthest point north yet achieved by the Thomsons, when he started work as assistant lighthouse keeper at Somber Head in Shetland. When I was in Shetland, I visited the archives there and had a look at the Shetland Times from 1921. There was no mention of the new assistant keeper at Somber Head in the Shetland Times and Advertiser during October and November 1921. Like most local and national papers in those days, the Times is closely packed with type. No pictures included other than the odd drawing for advertisements. Unlike the Shetland Times of today, though, much of the paper is taken up with news from the rest of the country and abroad. There was no TV or radio at the time, and even the national press would have been 2 or 3 days at least out of date before it arrived by boat from the mainland. So stories of murder in Bradford and Hull jostle for space, with missives sent by Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon to the Soviet government complaining loud and long of their interference in Afghanistan, India and Persia, which is a bit of a cheat when you consider the very recent assistance provided by the British to the White Army during the Russian Civil War. More locally, the Shetland County Council was in dispute with the Education Authority over its accounts and budget. Things don't really change much, do they? Had Hugh been so inclined during his rest periods, he could have attended the North Star Cinema in Lerwick. From the 3rd to the 5th of October, Madge Stewart and Reginald Fox, hopefully no relation to the dreadful Lawrence, appeared in the Iron Stair. In an attempt to entice viewers, the North Star's advertisement outlined the plot. It's a tense, dramatic story. One man goes to prison for his brother's crime, but eventually escapes and finds happiness, while the other takes his place to repair the damage he has done. Now, I might be missing something, but this does strike me as somewhat akin to what we would today call a spoiler. Many advertisements for mail-order goods appear, again understandably given the remoteness from major cities. Ladies' heavyweight winter knickers could be obtained for 4 shillings and sixpence from Moore, Taggart and Company of Glasgow. That's 22.5p in decimal and £13.88 allowing for inflation. Shetland ladies may well have longed for the jazz age equivalent of Primark to arrive, much as they do now. Also heavily promoted were Germaline for itchy piles, Andrew's liver salts, a commodity which Hugh and indeed my father's consumed for the rest of their days, and Fry's pure breakfast cocoa. Closer to home, an Aladdin paraffin mantle lamp was available from A.S. Isbister of Albert Flame. Whilst I expected the Times to be a fairly conservative organ, I was forgetting that Shetland has returned liberal and now led them MPs for a long period of time. Thus the following quote from an article entitled Women in Labour, which I approached with trepidation, but was pleasantly surprised to read. It is only possible to come to one conclusion, that women must be admitted in terms of perfect equality in the new and all-important fields which are opening before us, and she, claiming all labour as her own, must be economically and politically free, man's comrade. Admirable sentiments, which might still find opposition from the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg today. And each week a long list was published of vessels sailing between ports as distant as Sydney, Bombay, Yokohama and Singapore, and as comparatively local as Falmouth and Hull. These are a reminder that times were very different then. In many coastal communities, young males were often left with no other opportunities than to put to sea as crew in merchant service. Given the lack of telephone communications and the cost, no doubt, of telegraphy, as well as the speed of the postal service, relatives could gain some assurance as to the continuing movement of their vessels by scanning these shipping lists to see where their loved ones were heading. Whilst accidents at sea may still happen, they were of course more frequent in 1921 due, if nothing else, to the sheer volume of traffic. Things were much improved on previous centuries due, amongst other things, to the existence of lighthouses round our coast, and the many others built round the world, often with input from Scottish engineers. Which brings us back to Assistant Lightkeeper Hugh Thomson of the NLB as he makes his way to Summer Ahead.